Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Cynthia Gallaher's poetry collection, Drenched. So these are a set of poems sort of broadly dealing with liquid or liquidity, right? So there definitely are poems that are the sort of things we traditionally think of with like liquid-focused literature or art, right? Oceans, rivers, things like this. But she also has poems dealing with beer, with tea, with molten glass during the glass blowing process, with sewers and sewer water, right? So it's really sort of a broad and expansive conception of liquid. And I think that's really interesting, in part because one of the things that I always find, one of the things I always find fascinating about particularly oceanic literature is this interest in changeability and flux and flow, right? These sort of elements of dynamic movement that are associated with or represented by water in specific ways, because water constantly moves. The oceans are tidal, currents go in and out. There are sort of giant swirling ocean systems in which water moves from one part of the globe to the next. Rivers inherently flow. Even still water is incredibly susceptible to disturbance, right? And so water is very much about sort of change and movement and motion, at least as a literary device, right? I'm not necessarily making a sort of physical argument about the properties of water, although I would, as someone who's not a water scientist, a hydrologist, I believe is the proper term, I would say that to me, as a non-specialist, that sort of movement, changeability, plasticity, the ability to sort of reform itself into different shapes is a fundamental characteristic of water. And so a lot of the elements here are very much about sort of change and flux and flow, and the ways in which the movement or potential movement of liquid really challenges a terrestrial worldview that tends to be rooted in solidity, right? The idea that a thing is a thing, and that it is somehow coherent and whole, and has an essence that will remain unchanged on some level, right? So we get this, for instance, in the last poem of the collection. Usually I start with the first poem in a collection for videos like these, but I'm starting with the last one because Glass, the Liquid Solid is actually, I think, a really good example of this sort of broad thematic concern that people working in liquid-based literature frequently have, right? With again, change, flux, flow, etc. So, Glass, the Liquid Solid. Ever since lightning first hit sand and beachcombers picked up shards of this petrified light, humanity strove to imitate nature, the up-close and the far away, as we always do, ever wanting to fly like birds, to camouflage ourselves, to swim like fish, to see into stars. When sand, lime, and soda mixed with furnace fire, there arose a globule of glass as viscous as white-hot honey, blooming into a bright wobbly orange, rolling like taffy at the end of a blowpipe, the double-lunged giving it long air, exhale after creative exhale into a liquid, transparent bubble. From hot crucible and glory hole, the vase and goblet, art glass and light bulb, the windows of the world, microscope and telescope, our observant, mimicking eyes peering inward and upward from this bubble of earth. Right, so again, it's a poem fundamentally interested in change, in alternations between different states, in this case, solid and liquid, but also the sort of the fluctuating interactions of the human world and the natural world, right? And whether or not that's a sort of solid boundary or an ideological boundary is, of course, an important question that the poem does not necessarily go into, but it does sort of accept the standard Western philosophical conceit that we as humans are somehow separate from nature, right? This idea that we have found, our ancestors at some point have found beach glass, right? The sort of light, when lightning strikes sand, it sometimes creates glass, right? And that's very rare, but very cool. And this sort of prompts this reflection on our human desire to be like nature, which of course sort of belies the fact that we are a part of nature, right? We are part of the natural world. We are not separate from it, as much as we often act like we are in ways that are often quite environmentally destructive as we head into the sixth great mass extinction due to largely human-driven global climate change. But anyway, right, so this is sort of the idea here, right, is this notion that the liquidity of molten glass is in flux, right? Because what glass blowers do is they sort of adjust the shape of it using a variety of techniques. Glass blowing is very, very cool if you've never sort of watched someone do it. The Corning Museum of Glass in my home state of New York, very, very cool. But it's this sort of manipulation of the liquid state or the semi-liquid state of a substance that will become solid, right? But it's also a substance that is fragile, right? It's subject to breaking. And so again, the form, the structure of glass is fundamentally alterable, right? But the other component of this that is very central to Gallaher's poetic project is the intersection of liquids with material culture, right? With the ways that we experience ourselves within the world, we as human beings, right? As members of society, as people within particular cultural contexts, the ways in which we experience ourselves within culture is often profoundly tied to liquids. And so the next couple of poems that I'm going to read you are about that sort of that historical or cultural or sort of self-constructing aspect of culture that is linked to liquid. So the first one I'm going to read you is actually now the first poem of the collection. It's called Green Tea's Ceremony Within. It's the Asian paradox, modern, stressed Japanese seeking refuge in old ways. Some gather in boardrooms and sip what millennia ago was brewed from a handful of leaves blown by accident into the emperor's hot water kettle. The way of tea has its way, amidst Coca-Cola signs, raging trucks, and the clatter of multi-million heels hitting concrete instead of stockinged feet shuffling into a garden-side tea house. A tea ceremony of the heart takes a deep bow through each cup imbibed in downtown Tokyo to express principles of harmony, respect, purity, tranquility, as well as nourish with phytonutrients, protect with antioxidants, oxidize fat. Another late night under bright lights, but the tongue tastes tea on hillside forest, on a rainy afternoon, its own chartreuse umbrella. Later, in the mad crush of subway passengers, the tea drinkers still virtually seated on a tatami to admire a seasonal scroll, listen to the fire, smell incense mixed with aromas of freshly whisked matcha, live life in spite of one's wabi-sabi urban self. Right, so in this instance, we have the intersections between the traditional and the contemporary, right? That this sort of idea of like the modern world is something that we fundamentally want to escape from, right? And this is a sort of great Freudian insight, right? In a book like Civilization and Its Discontents. This idea that modern society, particularly capitalist modernity, is fundamentally antisocial, fundamentally destructive of the human, et cetera, right? These sort of ideas. This idea that we want to extract ourselves from modern life because modern life is fundamentally harsh and painful and destructive and about suffering, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the ways that we do that is through culture, right? Through cultural activities. In this case, through the tea ceremony, right? And Japan, so I haven't been to Japan, but my understanding, both from sort of programs that I've watched on TV, which are maybe more or less trustworthy, but also from people that I know who have been to Japan, is that Japan is this kind of weird, that's not like judgmental, but it's this sort of weird paradoxical blending of very conservative tradition with ultra futuristic modernism, right? So like you will have tea ceremonies in traditional houses with the like sliding panels and tatami mats and things like this. And then right next door, you will have like a techno club where robots are dancing to K-pop or whatever it is. I don't know, right? But this strange ability that especially Japanese urban culture has developed of sort of simultaneously being ancient and traditional and futuristic and technological, right? And to see these as sort of parallel coexisting strands, I think it's a very, very interesting thing. I'm actually just going to read you one more poem, but it's another one that sort of roots human conceptions, self-conceptions, ways of thinking about the world in material culture, right? The food that we eat, the beverages that we drink, the ways in which we encounter ourselves within a society made up or organized around stuff, or organized with stuff, might be a better way of saying it. But this poem, Beer Before Bread, also links to historical material culture. A little bit more than green tea's ceremony within, which definitely has that historical connection, but the historical connection there is really about sort of the relationship that we as contemporary people have to modernity and that sort of desire or need to escape modernity through an engagement with the past. Beer Before Bread, this next poem, is really more focused on how material history, cultural history, has sort of shaped the world. So this is Beer Before Bread. Our prehistoric nomad ancestors drank beer before learning to make bread, settling down to village life only to grow corn or barley for more beer. Such long-gone eras somehow resembled my Friday night landings, bleary-eyed, too tired to cook after a long work week, Mother's bread recipe sitting silent in the index file, making a dinner instead of 2 pints of Guinness at the Irish bar, replete with B vitamins, a boon of girlish iron, and lots of appetite-satisfying calories. By the time the bar's band started, you'd find me singing very old songs of my predecessors. Way, hey, and up she rises, way, hey, and up she rises, way, hey, and up she rises early in the morning, which some say is a pirate's song, repeated renditions burning up my meal and extra calories by night's end. Heading home to sleep on a feathery pillow, dreaming of homelands I'd never visit, rushing through centuries, adrift with other rovers on a long boat under a cockeyed Chicago moon, never gaining a wasted inch, but neither traveling one nomadic mile, with the most adventurous on board come early Saturday morning. Right, so this is, again, a poem that is interested in the history of material culture and how that continues to inflect the world that we exist in today, right? This sort of experience of our ancestors have done something, and this has profoundly created underpinnings for society. And that thing is fundamentally rooted in liquidity, right? The liquid world that we end up inhabiting and that we depend upon, right? So I think it's a really interesting one. In part, it's an interesting collection because, again, it takes a broad conception of the liquid world beyond just these sort of more traditional, sort of natural water spaces of oceans, rivers, lakes, etc., to conceptualize fluids as pervasive within human experience,